Hello, sir.
Hello, hello. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Okay, so we will start in 5 seconds. Is that ready?
Yeah.
Is that your mic check? We're not able to hear you.
Me?
No, Fiza.
Sir, am I audible now?
Yes, now audible. Okay.
Good morning, sir.
Namaste and greetings. I, Fiza Mahajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, नई दिल्ली, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI Web Policy Talk. We are gathered here today for a panel discussion on employment, livelihoods, and interim union budget 2024-25 as part of IMPRI 4th annual series of thematic deliberations and analysis of interim union budget 2024-25. This discussion is organized by Center for Work and Welfare, IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, as a part of IMPRI Web Policy Talk series. I welcome you all to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for tuning into this discussion. Now, let me introduce the esteemed gathering. Our chair for the session is Professor Suchita Krishnaprasad ji, former Associate Professor and Head of Department of Economics, Elphinstone College, Mumbai. Visiting Professor IMPRI. We welcome you, ma'am. The distinguished panelists for the session are Dr. Sandhya Iyer ji, Professor, Center for Public Policy, Habitat and Human Development, School for Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS, Mumbai. Mr. Sandeep Chachra ji, Executive Director, ActionAid Association, India and ex-co-chair, World Urban Campaign, UN Habitat. Professor R S Ghuman ji, Professor of Eminence, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. Professor Randhir Singh Rathore ji, Professor of Policy Planning and Research and Dean Academic Affairs in Sri Vishwakarma Skill University, Haryana. Professor Swarna Sadasivam Vepa ji, Visiting Professor at Madras School of Economics. Welcome everyone. We look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Now, without any further ado, let us start the program. It is my honor and privilege to invite Professor Suchita Krishnaprasad ji to start the program with the chair's opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
So, am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah. So, to start with, many thanks to IMPRI and Professor Arjun Kumar and his very helpful and cooperative team for having us here and having me here in this position. I'm sure I'll be learning a lot from all the experienced panelists over here. So to begin with, Indian economy had a largest dip in the GDP during the pandemic, which was about maybe 4 years ago. So it was a maximum dip of -25%. And successfully, we are supposed to have steered the growth rate up to 6 to 7% in the post-pandemic period. And Indian economy continues to present a picture of grand contradictions, according to me. It would be interesting to look at some of those. We are a land of startups and unicorns. We are supposed to be pharmacy of the world. We have provided affordable vaccines during the pandemic. We have a very high penetration of mobile phones from the streets to the elite class. Everyone has a mobile phone now. And the data is so cheap that we say there is a phone call at a cost of a postcard, to quote an industrialist. We have developed, and this is what I learned from eminent scientist Professor Raghunath Mashelkar, that we have developed apps to diagnose ECG. So I believe if we download that app Sanket, which has been developed by Indians, we can get an ECG at the cost of $1. We have developed an app called Shwas, which can detect lung infection just by breathing over the screen of the mobile phone. We have developed something called iBreast, which delivers a mammography at the cost, once again, of $1. And Professor Mashelkar in his interview said that there have been about 33 lakh scans which have happened through this app all over the world. And with all this glorious record, we still have a very depressing HDI ranking, which does not allow us to be very proud. That's one contradiction to start with. We know that our middle class is expanding. We are told that abject poverty has declined in the recent past, and yet income inequality is one of the highest in the world. In 2021, the top 1% of Indian population earned about 22% of total national income, while the bottom 50% made just about 13%. And India is among the most unequal countries according to the World Inequality Report. Coming to the labor force participation rate, according to PLFS data, it has risen marginally, but it is still quite low compared to our neighboring countries. We know that school enrollment has risen ever since Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, but the ASAR report, which has come recently, reveals a rather dismal picture of the real development, cognitive abilities among young ones. We are told that the world is watching Indian economy as a likely destination for investment. And as Mr. Mahindra in one of his post-budget interviews said on a media recently, many states have made significant progress towards increasing the ease of doing business. And yet, our own private sector is shy of making investment. The capacity utilization in manufacturing is said to have risen in the recent past, but it is still not enough to compel the working of an accelerator through fresh doses of investment. And we seem to be still waiting for the multiplier effect of the mega infrastructure projects that have taken place or pledged since last 4 or 5 years successively in each budget. And that has been one of our consistent themes since the last few budgets, emphasis on CapEx to expand and strengthen the physical infrastructure on a never before scale. What was little less than 3% in the budget of 2016, it went to 10% now of the total budget outlay. Be it Atmanirbhar Yojana or Gati Shakti or many other projects, there has been a big dose of investment in all kinds of infrastructure, be it railways or roads or ports and so on. However, that has eaten into our social sector expenditure and subsidies, which means that until the private sector investment picks up in response to these improved infrastructure projects, and perhaps even later, people who depend on, say, ICDS or midday meal or affordable creches or girls' hostels will have to sacrifice. When asked whether or not it is a time for the private sector to now rise to the occasion, Mr. Mahindra, in the same interview I mentioned before, said that, of course, the private sector has to now rise. But almost in the same breath, he also added that Mahindras expect the tractor sales to dip to a negative of 5% in the coming quarter. So that's a contradiction again. And this directly points to the possibility that not all is perhaps well in agriculture, which is most vulnerable to climate change, among other things. Our economy is known to be driven by consumption expenditure, and therefore it can remain afloat only through consistent growth in the number of jobs, which will keep on feeding that consumption expenditure, particularly in non-agricultural sectors. While AI has begun to enter into our world of work, finding an appropriately skilled labor force is quite a challenge. Of course, We have more IITs and IIMs and medical colleges and universities today. But whether the yield skill needed to carry the investment to its full fruition remains to be seen. The employability of engineering graduates, for example, was less than 7% according to the skill development report of, I think, 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And this deficit can be more damaging than the one mentioned earlier, namely the hesitation of the private sector to respond to the call of what our finance minister called crowding in. Even the states haven't been able to reutilize the funds that were allotted for developing infrastructure. The CAG report shows that from April to November 2022, the combined borrowings of 27 major states have reached only 33.5% of the total budgeted borrowings for the year. So, how inclusive are we, for example? So, while we aim at many schemes to strengthen the process of inclusive development, a study by Azim Premji University titled State of Working India 2023, Social Identities and Labor Market Outcomes is a stark eye-opener. It maps the roots of discrimination in the labor market based on gender, class, caste, community, etc. And this across the economic classes, not limited only to one or two economic classes, both in urban and rural settings. Of course, social prejudices are too deep-seated and they cannot be adequately addressed or redressed in an annual budget. But it is also true that some of our budgets in the past sound more like medium-term plans, though 5-year plans are now a thing of the past. Because here the expected outcome is mentioned in the budget, and it is committed to manifest in 2 or 3 years to 5 years to come. Remember the textile parks and so on. They're supposed to give out the results in next 3 years, next 5 years. So now we are outlining the goal for the next 25 years, which is perhaps stretching the scope of an annual budget much beyond its accepted connotation. This, of course, is an interim budget, and it reflects similar commitment with a vision of Vikasit Bharat. With those, opening remarks, may I now request Professor Sandhya Iyer from TISS to please express her views on Vikasit Bharat, the idea of Vikasit Bharat, the place of the overall manufacturing, and where does she see the social protection that we are aiming at, and where are the real wages going in manufacturing? Over to you, Sandhya, madam.
Good morning. I hope my audio is now stable. It was.
Yes.
So I would still like to say Happy New Year to all of you, seeing each one of you for the first time. And I think the interim budget, I don't know whether we had to think around what she was to say, because it seems to be only treading the pathways of the past. Nonetheless, I think there are some very serious problems about the pathways that are already chalked out, and we really know where. I think Professor Suchita has very rightly pointed out that the policy conundrums are visible, where we would want to portray ourselves as a dominant economy, an economy which wants to scale itself and become an alternative to China. I would want to place it that way in my argument. We are trying to essentially become the second China of the world, where we would want to portray ourselves as the most capable and most the fertile space to attract all sorts of activities, and be it in the manufacturing sector or in the economic language itself. I find the language very fascinating in the budgets. I think all interim budgets, particularly the vote on account budgets, whichever have been presented since 2002, have played around 2 or 3 areas. One, either it would try to tweak in the excise duties to make our commodities a little more cheaper, or it would try to make our sectors little less internally relevant and make ourselves more globally competitive. I think from Yashwant Sinha's time, that's what has been the vote on account budgets in India. So with Nirmala Sitharaman presenting her finale, I would say, of the NDA2 budget in this year, I think she continued doing that, but she did not play so much with the external account as much as trying to say that we need to do more. So what is it really throwing? If I had to understand the India at 47 story, which we have been told, the Vikasit Bharat narrative. And that's why when I was asked, what do I want to think around? I think the idea of manufacturing sector itself is becoming very, very complex. Why I'm putting it in this line is that I think anyone who has been working on the industrial sector or in the manufacturing sector analysis knows that we are a dual economy. We have a dominant so-called organized India Inc., which accounts for not more than 10% of enterprises even today as per the annual survey of industries, and a predominant bottom, which is the MSME segment. We really do not have anything in middle, and we still have a missing middle problem. And the COVID-19 pandemic had broken down the chain between the India Inc. and the lower bottom of the enterprises. So did our Vikasit Bharat really understand this? I'm not very sure. But yes, what are the 4 pillars of the Vikasit Bharat? The Vikasit Bharat seems to be saying that they're going to be sensitive to youth, women, vulnerable groups, and elderly in bringing in the transition to make it more inclusive. That's the idea of India at 47. Does the manufacturing sector really accommodate these constituents is the first question that comes to my mind. Not taking too much of my time, given the fact that Professor Suchita has very beautifully given the background. Let us understand what has happened. She did, the finance minister did articulate all the achievements of the last 10 years and constantly reminded us as to how is it different from the previous 10 years. So being a politician, she has done her job. But have her economic advisors really educated her enough about what are the economics of it? One, the capex story. Systematically over the last 3 years, we find that the capital expenditure outlays have been increasing at a rate of 10%. And this time we have gone to the numerological understanding of 11.1. We have increased it by 11.1% at about 11,100,000 crores, which is about 3.4% of the GDP. When I go to the budget documents below that, I find that our interest repayments are also come to the 11% mark and have also accounting for about 3% of GDP. So for all the capex that's going on, our interest repayments are also coming in alongside, and the budget is only burgeoning much more than even the centrally sponsored scheme budget. So that's my first point. That where is the capex really coming in, and what is the cost of the capex story for India? Secondly, if I were to understand from the growth projections, our finance minister has articulated that we are going to be growing at 6.5% and saying that we are likely to touch 7% by 2026. She has been very conservative. I hope she remains conservative even after the elections, because they're very positive about everything going on. They're very buoyant about the fact that India is the emerging economy which is going to shoulder the global recovery, even at the cost of dominant failures domestically. So somewhere, I think as a finance minister, she's forgotten to understand that the manufacturing sector of India is not about feeding the external world, but creating a mechanism for the domestic progress to take place. So again, there is a breakdown in our understanding there. Not painting a very bad story over here, therefore. If you look at all the evaluations that have come in about the interim budget, most of us are saying that let's not read too much here. But I would not want to not read it. I would want to read it for the simple reason that from this period till the election period, it's going to be at least about 6 months. We would be entering into the Kharif season, and I would assume that bulk of my MSME is going to be riddled with what is it going to do. I did a very simple action over here. I tried to interpret her budget speech. In the entire budget speech, there is not one mention of the word jobs, except for the fact that job will get created, but not about what type of job will get created. Last budget, they spoke about the fact that they are going to be creating jobs among the artisan class. That seems to be completely vanished. They spoke about the need to focus on MSME. And if you look at the policy brief which came out from the Ministry of Economic Affairs, they have given a very interesting paper talking about what all great things the MSME sectors is going to be doing, but the entire word of MSME is missing in the budget speech. It comes in just to say that we are going to be evolving, but what are we going to allocate? How are we going to do it? Again, no statement whatsoever. Therefore, if I take the entire conversation further, and let me assume for simplicity that the CapEx story has made three basic assumptions. One, that there is going to be a crowding in of private sector investments. Two, it assumes that the industrial index for manufacturing sector, the IIP, for instance, is going to be stabilizing around 6 to 7.5%. And three, that this crowding in will automatically mean that the jobs will get created. Let me test out all the three factors. When I look at the response of India Inc. or the private sector, as rightly pointed in the introductory remarks, we find that one, the private capital formation continues to be growing at a much slower pace than the government's capital formation as per CSO's recent estimates. Two, between June 2023 to the budget period, we find that the IIP has actually fallen down by about 1.5 basis points, and which is not a story which I am creating. It's there for all of us to see. So industrial production is not stabilizing, despite the fact that we seem to have come out, if I may use a corporate language over here, a festive quarter where we assume that the demand will go up and therefore the industrial production should have scaled up. So it has not gone up. Most of my industrial production index is still defined by the mining sector and the industrial and the electricity index. It basically means that the organized manufacturing sector has still not yet responded for all the stimulus that it has got from the government, be it in the space of infrastructure, be it in the space of electricity, energy security, and all other monetary policy frameworks that have been announced thus far. I would not completely accept the argument that most of this is owing to the external geopolitical crisis that's going on. If you look at the FTAs that India has signed so far in the last 2.5 years, most of the free trade agreements are yet to get ratified, be it with the UK or with the US. We are not yet been able to stabilize our external trade to minimize our trade deficit. Our foreign direct investments, however, continue to be the only green shoot right now, where I assume that investments are going to come in for the private sector. The third point, which is taking me to the jobs domain and what are its implications to the informal sector. The finance minister gave a very bold statement that the wages have increased, the real wages have increased, comparing, let's give her a benefit of doubt. She was comparing with 15-year-old data sets, saying that relatively are better off. Well, that's the point. But if I look at it with regards to the price volatility, if we look at it with regards to the fact that the government is going to be reducing food subsidies this budget, it essentially means that the so-called welfare food subsidy programs that are going to be provided for all are going to take a backseat. They are going to be giving 300 units of electricity subsidy. But again, with regard to the distribution and the net benefit, again, it's going to be unrealistic. So the real wages are going to be a bit more of a challenge to be maintained in the next 6 months. As per the PLFS data sets, yes, both under usual status and current weekly status, jobs have gone up from about 50 to 60%, which is a good improvement. But women's labor force participation rate, which is an important constituent of Vikasit Bharat, has taken a back seat. If you see the rural areas, women's participation has gone up. Typically, women have gone back to the agricultural sector. Whereas in the urban areas, the labor force participation rate continues to be around 26%, which means the urban, both formal and regular jobs do not see women yet. And this is where even the feminists have said that if I want women back into the labor force, it is not just about saying that the corporate sector needs to incentivize, but we need to also provide a more multi-pronged policy framework, which is again not really spoken about. What is more alarming to see is that allocations to the education sector, allocations to the health sector, Manrega have actually been reduced from the budget estimates of 2024.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about, sorry,
can
ma'am.
you wrap up? Can you wrap up?
Just about 1 minute and then I'm done. Just give me a minute, ma'am. Clearly, we realize that if the Vikasit Bharat does not look at the education of the youth, if it doesn't look at higher education strengthening where public subsidies are at most needed, particularly at a time when most of the time during a crisis situation, India is bringing out children from external countries at high cost, I think it's time that government spends on higher education over here if the Vikasit Bharat needs to be achieved. So the informal sector, formal sector story continues to be a visible breakdown. Our manufacturing sector has not been able to pull back itself to give jobs to the extent that we need. So though there is an improvement in production, jobs have only increased by about 1 basis points, even in the regular category. So there is a serious gap about the so-called crowding in and job creation story. I would like to end here and maybe come back later. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much for that detailed. And I always appreciate that you look at the language of the budget very carefully. And that's very interesting because that gives, that sometimes spills a lot of beans, not just the numbers, but the language and probably the number of times a particular phrase is used. That's a very interesting way of looking at and analyzing a document like a budget. Um, uh, the story of manufacturing, many people have been saying that we need to focus on that. And to just recall that interview that I saw of Mr. Mahendra, he said that we want to become a developed country by the time it's 2047, and that would require 16 times increase. 16 times, that means 1,600% increase in manufacturing. So it's good to be optimistic, but it's also important to be realistic and grounded at some time. Thank you so much for that note on what we are doing with education, skill, etc., which takes us to Professor Randhir Singh Rathore, Professor of Policy and Planning, and who has had first-hand experience in the Vishwaskarma Skill University at Haryana. Over to you, Professor Randhir Singh Rathore.
Thank you very much, Professor Suchita. And thanks to the IMPRI team for inviting me in this very lively discussion. Before starting, just I will take the few points which were raised during the opening remarks of Professor Suchita. One point actually, she raised the deficiency of skilled resources in country. For that, just I would like to put forward one point that if we will see the higher education ecosystem in the country, so in that higher education ecosystem, we are having around 50,000 institutes at different level. Maybe the university, maybe the colleges, a standalone institution. Altogether, they make around 50,000 institutes. Wherever, if you will see the institutes which are typically into the skill development ecosystem, so that number is a very meager, means less than 20,000 institutes are actually operating in that area. So if with that 20% institute or 20,000 institute rather, we want to create an ecosystem to increase our skilled workforce, so that is really a challenge. On other hand, we know that there is a direct link of productivity with skills. So in order to have the higher productivity, in order to have higher GDP, there is definitely a need to enhance the skill set or the skill competency of the young youth or the young generation with us. One more point, we know that we have a very large number of population basically into the working age group. Almost 100 crore, we can say, estimated that number. So again, there is another challenge to have a skill training facility or having some program related to skill development for that much larger number. and direct, if you want to have a relationship between that skill development and job creation, so definitely there will be a mismatch. It is not possible to have that much jobs for the resources for the people at that particular level. But what good points actually which are emerging out from this year's budget, as you, Professor Suchita, also mentioned in her opening remarks, that lot of focus is again on the infrastructure development. So there are different sectors actually, and the focus is on those sectors, and those sectors are basically able to create the jobs. May not be the 100% direct job, but there is a possibility of the indirect job creations also. So the first sector, that was the infrastructure sector, as both of the speakers said, that lot of emphasis is there on that infrastructure sector. So possibility is there that the jobs may be created in that area. The second part, which was touched upon this budget, is again greater budget layout for the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, and government is focusing to create more houses for the middle class and lower mid class segment. So again, if suppose that is going to increase, or the construction of houses is going to increase, that will again create job opportunities for the persons who are into the construction sector. One and two very important or very critical parts actually which emerges, which was announced in this year budget. The first I would like to say is that creation of that innovation fund, a 1 trillion rupees innovation fund. So that 1 trillion rupees innovation fund will encourage the research and development facility in industries. And when that research and innovation facilities will be developed in the industries, so definitely there will be a chances that the jobs will also, especially at the level of research, will be created at the industry level. Otherwise, what was happening typically, that all the jobs in the field of research was typically was in the educational or the research institutes which are governed or managed by the government. So this will again open opportunity, a door of opportunity for the researcher to go and work with industry in the field of R&D. So that is a new chapter probably I see which was announced in this year's budget. Another important aspect or another important announcement which was there, that was a focus on developing local tourism. So when a focus was there on developing local tourism, so again, a lot of jobs can be created in the field of tourism and hospitality if that focus is there in the field of tourism. So that sector again is able to create a lot of jobs in coming year in that particular area. In addition to that, again, the focus was on manufacturing sector, especially the automotive sector. And another very critical or important area which was emphasized in this year's budget was in the field of semiconductors. So though it was announced in 2021 also, but more rigor is being given on development of that semiconductor facility. So again, in both of this area, means automation in the field of manufacturing, as well as creating or developing India as a semiconductor hub, there will be a requirement of 100 and 1,000 of highly skilled resources. So again, that will open up a new chapter, a new dimension for development of the skilled resources in these areas. So this means there are some high tech area, there are some low skill competency areas. So overall, if you will see, there is a mix of both. Means in the terms of skill competency, a very high level of skills, very low level of skills, starting from the construction, we are going to manufacturing the semiconductor chips. So a complete spectrum can be seen there in which the investment is promised in this particular budget. And if suppose that investment is there, definitely the job opportunities can be created. Another area was that of green technology, and Honorable Finance Minister announced that 10,000 crore for rooftop solar for 10 million houses. So if suppose 10 million houses have to install solar PV system over their rooftop, so not only that will help in attaining that zero emission norm by 2070, but at the same time it will also create a lot of job in that area. Installation of that solar PV system, then electrification means electric connections. So for the PV installer technicians, for the electricians, again there is a possibility that a lot of new jobs will be created in these areas also. The emphasis is also on national green hydrogen mission, as well as coal gasification type of projects. But these are no doubt the national hydrogen mission and the coal gasification. They are typically a very technology intensive areas basically, but again they may also help us in creating some jobs in these areas. So again, at the end, I would say that a complete spectrum is covered in this, that jobs will be created by in all such areas: tourism, construction, semiconductor, manufacturing. One more point actually I would like to address, which was raised by Professor Sandhya, that in last year's budget, the finance minister promised for creation of jobs for artisans, but this year there was no reference was made on that. But I would just like to inform you that there is a scheme actually, that is PM Vishwakarma scheme, and in that PM Vishwakarma scheme, again I think around 4,824 crore, that amount is specified for that, and that is typically to support the artisans to upgrade their skills and attach other you can say the disciples who will be working with those gurus actually to learn those skills which are disappearing over the period of time. So overall, I will say that this interim budget or vote on account has opened a lot of opportunities, will create a lot of job opportunities. It is not directly seen since the word job is not there, but indirectly, definitely there is lot of opportunities are there, lot of areas are there in which there will be certainly creation of new jobs in coming time. So
Yeah.
these were
So
the initial remarks from me. Thank you.
thank you so much, Professor Rathore, for laying out the entire array of efforts that the government is looking at, and the budget is trying to kind of lay out in front of us, from high tech to low tech to traditional skills, and um, these would probably, as you said, open up new avenues for earning decent livelihoods. More questions might appear on your presentation later on. So, but for the time being, can we move on to Mr. Sandeep Chachra, who's the Executive Director of ActionAid India? Since Professor Rathore has already pointed out that, all kinds of skills and all kinds of levels of technology are being addressed in skill development, from high tech to low tech to traditional, probably you can look at the inclusiveness of growth. And he's also mentioned urban housing and how it is likely to generate jobs. So I request Mr. Sandeep Chachra to touch upon these issues of inclusiveness, urban housing, and any other matter that interests him in this budget, which relates to the livelihood of people.
Thank you, Professor Krishnaprasad, and it's an honor to be here. And thank you, IMPRI colleagues, Dr. Arjun and team, for having me here. And yes, Happy New Year, Sandhya ji. It's been a while. We seem to be meeting almost around this particular time of the year on the IMPRI webinar. So it's an honor. I'll follow the earlier speakers, and you made some very pertinent points in your opening address, Professor Krishnaprasad, and then I followed what you were saying, Sandhya ji, and then of course Professor Rathore. So let me sort of make a few points how I reflected this interim budget. At the outset, let me say, interim budgets, vote on accounts, as you said, have and you mentioned it. Generally, for me, it's a litmus of how confident the government is going into elections. And most of the interim budgets, yes, they are limited by what they can do, but the announcements are always made. So in the past. So this time around, it seems that the government is pretty confident going into the elections because they've chosen a path of fiscal prudence. And a strong fiscal prudence. So we were expecting in the run-up to the budget, one was talking on some channel and expecting that, okay, the fiscal deficit target might be pegged to somewhere around 5.5 or 5.6%. And lo and behold, in this budget, the finance minister goes and says it'll be 5.1%. So obviously, they have chosen that path, and it seems they're pretty confident because, as you rightly said, the finance minister took time to recount the growth and the achievements and the report card of the government in the last 10 years and didn't really announce very major sort of game changers. One was expecting a few, frankly, and I hope that await the full budget. Now, if you look at welfare schemes per se, you pointed to some as was being discussed just now. But if I look at almost all of the social welfare programs, including the ones which pertain to livelihoods and employment and housing as well, and I'll come to each, there seems to be hardly nominal or if at all none growth in any of those in terms of budget allocation. See, I'm only now going to look at what the budget has said and what not what the decadal progress has been. I mean, that's another debate in terms of numbers and data. But let's look at it one by one. So if you look at if one of the biggest employment creators in the history of the world, if I may call it, the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Act, if you look at the revised estimates of the last year, that's 86,000 crores. And some number crunching I've managed to do in these days, but not fully. But if you look at what's allocated, is once again 86,000 crores. So the expectations, and you were pointing to it, Professor Sandhya, the expectations that rural distress, there is rural distress, there's no debate about it. You talked about inequality, you talked about wages and the data around wages. So if rural distress has to be met, there are other measures. But one of the measures certainly is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. The point that you are saying that women's workforce participation has gone up in the rural world in India is partly possibly on account of the fact that women are getting to work because of falling incomes. So more and more women are coming out. Now, these are speculations, and I don't have ready data to prove it, but there's a lot of debate going on this. So in any case, one would have expected an enhanced allocation. We're growing at 7%. Estimates are 7.2%. You mentioned the conservative estimate of the finance minister, but that would mean that the growing revenues, instead of being devoted to reducing fiscal deficits, possibly could have been redirected. I think it's a missed opportunity, and I think it comes in the... So if you look at MGA and REGA, the quantum hasn't grown, the scope hasn't grown, the number of days haven't grown. 86,000 crore is the revised estimate of last year's, and this is coming at the back of almost stagnant or declining allocations to MGA and REGA over the years. I, of course, was expecting, and your second point you made with reference to urban employment guarantee. Of course, 5 or 6 of the states have some kind of urban schemes, Professor Prasad, but we were expecting that there would be a guarantee and a central support as far as the question of women's workforce participation in the urban world goes, which remains low, as was pointed out to by the earlier speaker. I'll turn my attention into other expectations unmet. Hopefully, I'm an optimist, an eternal optimist. So hopefully they'll be met in the full-blown budget. But this budget gives a direction. I actually personally welcome the Gyan framing, the Garib, the Yuva, that framing I welcome, the Annadata and the Nari. At least it gives a room to debate and possibly gives a room to focus the path that we wish to travel. But in that spirit, let me then go to the question of where the Annadata is, where the Kisan is. A load of expectations that PM Kisan, which is at the volume of about 6,000 annually. I mean, given this whole situation of the agrarian challenge and the agrarian distress, I'm not going to get into minimum support price at the moment, and much needed escalation of MSP. Some have been done, as the finance minister said in her speech. But for the sectors where MSP is not, where for the crops MSP doesn't cover. So one was expecting that. But if I were to just come back to PM Kisan Samman Nidhi, we probably would have done well, and I hope we do it later, to at least double it in how, we are talking of doubling farmers' income, but here we're somewhere else. We are at the point where the 6,000, it's a nominal increase, maybe to 9,000, maybe to 10,000, maybe to 12,000 could have happened. I mean, on the welfare programs, almost all of those have been extended for another 5 years. The PM Garib Garib Ann Kalyan Yojana, the food subsidy that you're talking of, that shows some growth, and it's welcome that it's been extended. But on the other hand, that tells you what's the kind of rural poverty and distress, and what's the kind of that distress needs that 80 crore people need it, the Ann Yojana. Professor Prasad, you mentioned on housing. Now, and the previous speaker, Dr. Rathore, was speaking to housing. It's welcome. We know that there is still almost a 20 million housing shortfall by government's own data. The numbers would be higher in rural India and about 3 million in urban India. But if I were to look at the budget figures of allocations, so it's a welcome step that the budget says that 2 crore new houses will be built over the next 5 years in rural India. So it at least addresses some of the shortfall, or the equivalent to the shortfall by government's data, slightly less than overall data. But that would have meant that we enhance the allocations of the budget. Should you come back to the allocations with reference to PM Awas Yojana, urban and rural combined, if I go by budget estimates, there was around 79,500 crores in the budget of 23-24. Revised estimates, of course, are lower in that instance, and that says that the program has not been fully implemented. But the allocations made now are roughly around 80,671 crores. So not a major jump there. So the question then becomes, and to Professor Rathore's point, the question then becomes that if we were to make an average of 40 lakh houses every year in order to make 2 crores over the next 5 years, where is the money going to come from? Is it enough? So there are those number crunching sort of things that we would like. In terms of employment, once again, in the manufacturing sector, there's a lot of hue and cry about production linked incentives. Almost all of the industry wants PLIs because it's a subsidy for them. Yeah. But how much goes to the workers? Let's debate. But even on PLIs, one was thinking perhaps the PLIs could be extended to sectors which are largely women sectors, garments, for instance. Tannery, of course, is not women, jewelry making, for instance. So there were expectations that even if we take the minimalistic path of PLIs, which doesn't directly give money into the hands of the workers, but even so, in that sort of drip down effect, it gets enhanced and goes into the hand of sectors where it's needed. Social Security Fund, Professor Prasad, it's a missed opportunity once again, in my opinion. We had the Social Security Code in 2020. We had the Occupational Health and Safety Code in 2020. It's not in implementation. It's in limbo. It's 4 years into it. it was an opportunity for the government. We may critique as it is. There are gaps there, but I think it's a progress. But in that regard, possibly this was a huge opportunity to announce a national social security fund. Let's remember that as far as construction industry is concerned, there is money because there's cess on the construction industry. But for the other sectors, there's none. So in which instance, this was a huge opportunity, apart from employment generation, which would have given boost to cover the huge unmet needs of social security of the informal workers of this country. So I would want to say that that's
Yeah.
something. I mean, I know you're going to remind me to close now, but but very quickly, I just want to touch on climate and then give rest to, I mean, close my presentation. Lovely to hear the solar rooftop solar program. Why? Because this is the path for a developing South country. It allows decentralized energy, it allows autonomy, enables autonomy of people, of course, leads to saving, transmission losses, so on and so forth, multiple benefits. So I'm not going to take this opportunity to wax about wane about the benefits of solar programming. But having said so, the point is, 1 crore households, yes, this is a good step, but it comes as part of existing program. This is not a new program. So it's been performing slow over the years. So this has been taken as an opportunity to, let me say, revamp and reboost the program. So welcome. But let's talk of climate in a slightly bigger manner. Professor Rathore was talking of net zero target by 2070. Wonderful. Now let's link it up to the people who are affected the most on account of climate crisis. And there are enough and more studies in the world, including in India, including RBI's own data, which says that about 4.5% of the GDP would be lost to on account of heat stresses, on account of climate impacts in our own country. And the most impacted, needless to say, are the workers, which both in the rural sector, agricultural workers, construction workers, and all range of workers, people who are at the front end of intervening with nature, the pastoralists, the fisher folk, and the so on and so forth. So, to my mind, the expectation from this budget and the hope for the full budget, needless to say, interim budgets is an interregnum, would therefore be to take that centrally into budget allocation purposes. To start with, the idea of the compensation fund for those who, I'll give you an instance very quickly, Professor Prasad. There are studies and a ground experience in working with informal workers in urban settings. Take Delhi, for instance. If you take Delhi over the last year, roughly about 2 months of wage day loss has been there. Data is not exact, between 2 and 3 months of wage loss has been there for construction workers in Delhi itself on account of what you call heat stress and on account of pollution. So the industry has been shut periodically over the last 3-4 months for various reasons. And roughly those number of days informal workers have lost, in which instance there's a crying need to compensate those wage losses, to compensate that loss and damage that's happened. The same story can recurs for the agricultural workers, and there's not enough systematic ground studies in this regard. So one would have wanted climate loss and damage compensation fund being talked of in this budget. Similarly, the initiatives taken last year of the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, there was a Ganga corridor made. So one was expecting that perhaps this transition to sustainable agriculture would have been given a boost through huge budgetary allocations. That's something people need in order to mitigate and adapt to the climate impact. Mangrove initiative was started last year. Wetlands initiative was started in the last budget. So those are things one would have wanted continuity and expansion to. I'll stop here, aware that there are many more points, but I've run out of time. Thank you, Professor Prasad.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to and it's very painful to ask somebody who has such rich experience on the ground to wrap up the presentation, but that's the painful duty I have been given, and there'll be more to learn from you in the second round of discussion, I'm sure. Can I now request Professor Swarna Sadasivam Mega ma'am, former visiting professor in Madras School of Economics, and since much has been said about the labor force participation of women, the agricultural sector, and the health and nutrition part, and I believe there's enough work on pulse production by that madam has done, which is there on the internet for all of us to see. This government, you remember, at some point was focusing on pulse production to increase the nutrition level. So over to you, ma'am, for your observations on this budget.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I would still like to touch upon a couple of points on women's work participation and agriculture, and then I'll come to the aspect of pulses and also seeds production, which in fact the finance minister has mentioned before. The first point I would like to make is that about the recent data on weekly status of the labor force participation, the workforce participation data, which has come out for 2023, 22-23. And something very interesting there, which I want to point out. If you look at the weekly status, there is increase definitely of the women's participation, both in the rural and urban areas. And the worker population is more important than the labor force participation, because labor force participation includes both the unemployed and the employed together. And so let us only look at the worker population ratios. In rural India has gone up from 20.1% in 2017-18 to 33.2% in 22-23. I mean, there's a huge increase. And again, I mean, the same with the urban also. Urban female work participation ratios have increased from 17.1% in 2017-18 to 21.8% in 22-23. And another very interesting aspect is that as far as the participation rates are concerned, there seem to be a big jump from 21-22 to 22-23. I mean, which happens to be 5.3% jump in the participation ratio of women. One would wonder, what is it that is happening? So, I mean, it's something about 40% labor force participation is something which we should consider for a country like India, which is as low as sort of a 13% labor force participation for urban women, and probably which has come down to something like 20% for rural women. I mean, let us say in 2011-12, and now boosted up to 40%, makes one get up and stand up and look at it. I mean, where are these women working? So I happened to look at the report, and the table 17, in fact, gives the details. And I find that the female work participation is 71% of self-employed. Self-employed not only on own account, but also the helpers. And the second interesting point is that the regular salaried employment in the rural females happen to be 8%, and then 21% as casual labor. So the entire chunk of the women's participation is coming in the rural sector, mainly from self-employment. That's the point which I want to make. And similarly, even for urban, the self-employment levels are pretty high. And if you look at urban females, you find that 40.4% are self-employed, and 50.8% are regular salaried, and 8.9% are casual labor. So obviously, the major jump in the women's work participation is coming only from self-employed. So this is something very interesting. And then what is the related aspect which is important to mention is that we have overtaken China, and our population is higher than that of China because we have crossed China's population in 2023, according to the UN population projections. And so obviously, and our growth rates have also fallen. So, and the number of people who are entering the labor force are, over the time coming down, but at the same time, our population will not fall, but actually China's population has fallen in actual numbers, but that will happen for India only about 2.5 decades later. Not anytime sooner. So we continue to have, and more people, who will be there in actual numbers, though the growth rates, in fact, have fallen. So what is happening is definitely there's a shortage of labor, particularly for agriculture, and that too for manual labor. So since the manual labor in agriculture has come down, and also the wages have gone up, and relatively, and so the cost of cultivation also has gone up, which I'll take it up a little later. But right now, what is happening is the agriculture, in fact, is becoming the major employer. And another very interesting point is that, like CMI has been repeatedly been saying that in 2020, many people went back to agriculture. In fact, it has clearly shown in the last year's employment figures that the percentage of people dependent on agriculture has gone up from 42.5% in sometime in 17-18 to something like 46% last year, because economic survey shows. So what is happening? We're talking about transformation. We're talking about transformative India. What does transformation mean in the economic terms? In the economic terms, transformation means is a condition where the number of people who are dependent on agriculture and the GDP which comes from agriculture, and the gap between the two comes down, and which is called the turning point. So, this is the turning point. Most of the East Asian countries, including China, have reached that, and we are not going to reach that anytime soon. So real transformation means shifting people from agriculture to other occupations. So that is something very important. And then, till then, the productivity in agriculture is the lowest, obviously, because 18% of the GDP and 46% of the population, and that too population increasing from 43%, 42% to say 46%, which means is definitely, as far as transformation is concerned, is a regressive step and not actually a progressive step. But then let us forget about that, and let us concentrate on the what is happening to agriculture, because a large number of them are self-employed. Indian agriculture is supposed to be growing at 4%. That's what the report says, the recent one. And so obviously, you expect a lot of money to come to these people. But then there are two factors which I want to mention about. I will not take too much time, only 2-3 points I just want to make. See, one point is that agriculture is a loss-making proposition the world over. It is no different in India. You cannot continue to depend on agriculture and accommodate more people and increase their productivity. The productivity keeps falling if you transfer many more people into agriculture. That is not the right thing to to happen. And then, if you really want to see how much of the consumer's rupee is going to the farmer, what percentage of the consumer what share of the total money paid by the consumer is going to the farmer is the question. And also same with exports. Our agricultural exports are doing very well, no doubt about it. But how much of the export dollar, what percentage of the export dollar from agriculture is reaching the farmer who is producing that? And that is the question. So if you look at that, you find that the agriculture being a loss-making proposition for many people, needs support. And then it needs support all over the world. I mean, not only India is not an exception, but other countries are able to do it because they've already reached a turning point, and the number of people who are dependent on agriculture is much lower, and they can, in fact, be able to support agriculture. And so the productivity of people in agriculture has fallen. I mean, it's relative to that of the non-agricultural worker. So the agricultural productivity of the workers have fallen, and now what is happening to the increased agricultural growth? The agricultural growth and the increase in prices and export prices as well as the consumer prices of food and others have not been really reaching the farmer. So the market efficiency is very low. So between the big gap between what the farmer gets and even the MSP, many people don't get. I mean, it's good that the MSP is hiked and it is increasing. And recently, there's a study which clearly shows that both for the wheat farmers and as well as the rice farmers, say, for example, UP, Madhya Pradesh and other states, the farm business income has declined in real terms. So if you look at, suppose if their incomes are increasing at, say, at 1% or 2%, and then if the inflation rate is 6%, even still they lose out. So what is happening is, probably it is something like a social surplus extraction. You know, maybe it's too strong a word to use. I mean, I wouldn't like to use it because it was used by Bipin Chandra, way back of the situation which occurred of agricultural exploitation in during the British period. But at the same time, what is happening here is there is no rosy picture for all those who are self-employed in agriculture and all those, whose incomes are pretty low. And now coming to the support to agriculture. So there's something like called PSC, the Producers Support to Agriculture, which has been estimated for all the countries all over the world. And so 2019 figures is what we have. Probably we also figures, which shows that even a country like China is supporting the percentage of support to the total value of gross receipts happen to be something like 12% or so. But whereas in the case of India, it happens to be minus 4.8%, despite all the support that has been going from the to the farmers from the government. No doubt the government is giving 6,000 rupees, and some of the southern states are giving something up to 10,000 to 12,000 rupees as a transfer to the farmers, no doubt about it. But then the cost of production now today happens to be something like 1 lakh of rupees and 1,70,000 to 1 lakh per hectare of rice and wheat. And so, I mean, compared to that, where does this stand? And you have to pay for fertilizer, you have to pay for pumps and pump sets, and also you have to pay for labor, and the labor cost is also going up. And then you can't say that cut down the labor cost, because if you cut down the labor cost, that means in fact you are making more people, become much more miserable. So undoubtedly, agriculture needs support, and the type of support that's been given is not sufficient. And just one more point which I want to make and want to close it. That is, we have missed the opportunity of shifting the population from agriculture to non-agriculture, particularly to labor-intensive manufacturing sometime in the 80s, when the whole of the East Asia did it and we didn't do it. And it didn't happen in the 20th century, but we have just come into the 21st century when it becomes even more difficult to shift people from agriculture to labor-intensive manufacturing, because today a large number of things can be imported much cheaper than being manufactured here. And so we have caught in a situation where we have to shift a large percentage of population to get the transformation of agriculture and the transformation and the turning point, which most of the countries of the Asia has achieved, and we failed to achieve. And then just one more point I want to say and close. That is, agriculture is institutional agriculture is increasing, And for example, shrimp farming has been mentioned by the finance minister as being very good and, giving us agricultural exports. No doubt about that. But then if the institutional agriculture becomes the getting the major share of the entire agricultural income, and is generating the major share of the agricultural income, what happens to the rest of the people who have very little land? About 85% of those in agriculture have less than 1 hectare, much smaller amount. And so where do we stand? How are we going to support them? Is the question which you have to ask. It is a challenge. Only thing I want to say is that we are progressing. We're not regressive. We're not regressive like African countries. We have been growing, we have been moving forward. But then the point is we are moving forward very slowly. But then what can happen is if moving forward, particularly for the lower sections of the people, becomes very slow, there's a danger of us becoming like an African country. What has happened in Africa? In Africa, institutional agriculture, in fact, has taken away all the lands and shifted people to the urban areas without any jobs. And so all of them are educated and a huge urban slums have come up because of that. Thank God it didn't happen in agriculture. At least people are going back to agriculture. And so there are many challenges which we have to realize. And the next budget, in fact, have to incorporate most of them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your enormous knowledge, not just of India, but of so many other countries and bringing the story together. Probably in the question answers, you would like to take up if something comes up about the Annadatta and the Kisan, basically we want to once again bring it back to the current budget. Maybe more light can be shed in the question
maybe
answer.
because the shortage of time, I couldn't.
So, but it was very
those,
interesting to, it was
ranks.
very interesting that you shared the nuances of labor force participation rate among women, that it is self-employment and so not so glorious as it sounds in the number. Thank you very much. And can we now move on to Professor Ranjit Singh Ghuman? It would be a pleasure to listen to you, sir, who is a professor of eminence in the Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, and he has an extensive experience on rural development and how it works and where the budget is trying to give a push to rural development. A very appropriate thing to speak about after Swarna madam has laid out what the kind of crisis, and still, although the progress is happening in the agricultural sector, the kind of problems that the sector is facing. So if more people are going back to agriculture, we need to look at rural development. And so can we have your opinions on rural development vis-a-vis the budget? So.
Thank you, Chair. And good afternoon to all the fellow participants. I do appreciate the duty of the chair. It's very, very difficult duty, and often people overshoot the time. It's but natural. I will try to stick somewhere between 8 minutes and the time taken by other speakers. I hope the chair will be generous to me also. At the very outset, I would like to make 2-3 bold statements. One, I think it's from an interim budget, it's too much to expect, and it is politically unethical to announce big statements because it's vote on account just for 3 months. So I listened to the entire budget speech, read it in between the lines. It was political bold statement and less a budget speech. That's one I would like to make. Second, when you compare 10 years of the previous regime we must focus on 10 years of the achievements of the previous regime as well. It's always good to appreciate one's achievements, but SWOT analysis was missing. So I don't look at the discussion from the budget because it was an interim budget. But I would like to focus on 10 previous budgets, which this government has been doing all through. And broadly, when you compare the 10 previous budgets or 10 years of the previous government, one finds that GDP at constant prices in the previous government has been higher multiple than this 10 years. Similarly, per capita income. So it is, I think, not very fair to give such statements in the interim budget. That's one or two statements. And now I'm coming to the rural development or the rural economy of India. Still, Professor Swarna and Professor Suchita had made my task somewhat easy. And I would like to give 2-3 statistics. One, still 66% of population of India is in rural, 70% workforce is in rural area, and share in GDP of the rural economy is around 45-46%. This is the story by statistics. 45-46% share of the rural economy, 70% workforce, and 66% of population is sharing that. So we can say that India is still predominantly rural economy, and agriculture is still the mainstay of the rural economy. We must take it. Niti Ayog's discussion paper of 2022 states that 54% workforce is in agriculture and GDP share is 18%. But at the moment, if we look at 45% workforce is in agriculture and 15% share of income is in agriculture. It speaks these two figures speaks the agrarian crisis or agrarian distress or farmers' distress. These two figures are enough to have an. Now, if we take of total workforce employed in agriculture, it is 152 million around, and it in 2017, but it came down to 147.92 million now, which means the workforce in agriculture in absolute sense is declining over the period of time. How do I interpret it? The agriculture sector is pushing workforce out of the agriculture, and non-agriculture sector is not welcoming or attracting the surplus workforce. That is how I interpret it. So shrinking of work employment days, man days, and shrinking of income is the real crux of the rural economy as well as the agricultural economy. So a decline of 4.3 million workforce in the agriculture sector is a serious indication, and they are nowhere there in non-agriculture sector. What we can do it rural non-farm sectors development, but rural non-farm sector development over the period of time for the last, say, 30-40 years. Ramesh Kumar's paper of 2017 in EPW states, Niti Ayog's member, says that non-farm rural sector has developed, but employment from the rural sector has not been there in the, it has been from the urban sector or nearby towns. So that is again the other problem with the rural economy of India. And of course, impact of climate change is again a serious problem. And climate change is first impacts, first impacting agriculture, and then rural people, then the poor people. And we all know agriculture is an informal sector. And in the informal sectors, 86% of your holdings are small holdings. That is again the serious problem. And one must not forget that NERC's disguised unemployment is still very, very prominent in agriculture. We have done some work on it. If you take 8 hours a day and even 300 days employment, it's far, far less than. One looks to be employed in agriculture or somewhere employed, but it's grossly, disguisedly unemployed. And second, the change in employment criteria in the various census. Of course, 2021 census is not there. 2024 has come, but we are nowhere near census, conducting of census. No, but the data available so far tells us that, you see, census data still says that workforce, as Press Swarna, I beg to differ with Swarna, Press Swarna, in the sense that though we see that people are moving to agriculture, workforce is moving to agriculture, but they are grossly underemployed, disguisedly unemployed, and the census change in the employment definition from 3 months to 6 months, even if one is employed for 1 day, one is taken as employed. I think that is another problem. Now, then agriculture's push factor is there, but pull factors are not there. And low demand from rural area in the non-farm sector, as I told you earlier. So I would like to focus on, for a minute, on Manrega. As I think Professor, some previous speaker focused on it, that Manrega's allocation has almost stagnating, and in the real sense, it is shrinking. So 86,000 crore if in the 2023 budget, and 6,000 crore in the next budget, I think it is shrinking, and it is not focusing on that. Another important issue with the rural economy as a whole, or rural society as a whole, is rural-urban gap in education, health, skill, physical infrastructure. I think we have done some work on rural-urban gap in Punjab, and we have found that rural schools, rural hospitals are much behind the urban facilities which the urban people are having. And as earlier speaker told, labor force participation by women, I think it is again a misnomer, in the sense that labor force participation is increasing or declining depends on the wage rate, and the opportunity cost of being employment and opportunity cost of not being employment is another issue. Environmental degradation and depleting water table is again a problem, particularly in the northwest India, particularly Punjab, Haryana, then western UP. It's very, very serious problem. And still food insecurity and food security are the issue. 45% of the agricultural land is still is under irrigation, assured irrigation, but the rest is rain fed and all that. And still, and I would like to draw your attention to MSMEs. Once previous speakers focused on it, MSMEs. MSMEs are the backbone of the rural economy, or the sub-urban economy, which must be focused. And nowhere, of course, lip sympathy to MSMEs was there, even during the COVID period when they supported. We are allocating some public funds to MSMEs and all that. But ethos is to support the corporate sector. Whether you take the corporate tax, whether you take other things, ethos is that, and the corporate sector and the capital intensive sector is not going to generate employment, particularly for the rural people who are unemployed. And all of us know unemployment in youth is 20 to 22%. So what I suggest is that raising the level of consumption and effective demand, and thereby giving to give a push to the consumption-led growth paradigm demands that rural economy must be developed, rural economy must be focused. Without rural economy, India cannot grow, and still we are predominantly rural economy. But unfortunately, rural economy is being given some doles, but not being empowered. How long this will not raise the consumption level, consumption demand or consumption level in the rural economy. It will sustain, of course, subsistence level at the most, but to generate employment in the rural sector, to support the rural economy, we will have to focus on agriculture as well as the non-agricultural sector in the rural economy, and employability and processing of the agricultural produce to generate employment in the rural society and rural economy. That is must, but unfortunately, this is not being taken seriously. And of course, your corporate sector is moving to the rural area for demand, but demand is not being generated from the rural area. In fact, private consumption and private investment both are shrinking, and consumption data tells us that this is a serious drag on the effective demand in the country, and of course on the growth and employment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for, first of all, beginning with a note that, just a moment. Yeah. Starting with a note that this is, of course, an interim budget, and then to move on to chalk out how rural sector is important. So when you talk about disguised unemployment being present, and Professor Swarna also talks about lower productivity in agriculture, whether we say that people are going back to agriculture or they are being refused by agriculture, it basically means that there is a floating population which doesn't know where to settle down. And that might be a more serious question. It's something that Harris Todaro had highlighted in their migration model. And that once again brings up the question of informal sector, whether urban or rural, and this floating population somehow trying to eke in a livelihood one way or the other, and therefore being forced to be self-employed one way or the other, just chai banake, something like that. And which means that you can't call them self-employed, or you can't call them entrepreneurs. Okay. So there's a so with that,
one thing more I would like to
yeah, sure, go ahead.
that, hunger index, global hunger
Yes.
index is
Yes.
very, very important to take account of where we stand. That
Yes.
global hunger index, the index latest 2023 is
Yes.
111
Yes.
out of 125. So means only 14 countries are below us, and we are having a serious problem of hunger, despite the fact that we are giving food subsidy or free ration to 80 crores of the people. Thank you.
Right. So maybe the floor can be opened for questions within or clarifications that we might require from each other as panelists. Is there anything that we would like to ask each other or get little more collaborations from each other regarding any issue that touches the livelihood of people? and where the budget is trying to pitch itself. Or else we can probably then keep it open to people. Can I ask Professor Rathore, that he spoke also of green technology and the solar panels that this current budget is making an allocation for. Is there any data of how many jobs it can create? Because I think in many other countries where technology shift was taking place, uh, going to green technology was a major source of creating jobs and livelihoods. Of course, when we have solar panels, the next question is maintaining them. Very often, we do those, install the technologies, but then the next question is about maintaining them. Um, any any light would you like to throw, Professor Rathod, on employment generation possibilities? Is there any data that we have on innovation fund and the green technology and how many jobs it is expected to create? Is it, yeah, Professor Rathod, is he there?
Ma'am, I don't think so. He's in the meeting.
Okay. So, Mr. Chachra, we spoke about fiscal prudence. Yeah. You spoke about fiscal prudence, but I have a little comment there. Currently, we are being told that our loan to GDP ratio is coming to something like 85%. Okay. So our debt to GDP ratio is coming to something like 85%. And unless we become prudent, it can probably touch something like 100%, which is a very, very important red mark. And probably that is the reason why there is a good, smart arithmetic required for fiscal prudence. Of course, even after the budget, we can still draw on RBI. That has happened number of times. That was a little comment. Anybody would like to come in and ask questions here? There's one question from Mr. Jaspal Singh now. Will the FPO pattern really work? I don't know who it is addressed to, but would anybody on the panel like to take this question up?
Yeah,
Will
I
the FPO? Yeah.
I'll say something on it. And yeah, sorry, Professor, if you want to
It's
go.
okay. You go ahead, please.
No, please. Please go ahead. I'll comment
No,
later.
you can go ahead. No issue.
No, what I mean, I concur with what you were saying, and what Ghuman Saab was saying as well. And I want to make a few things on that. One, I think this idea, although you were talking about it in a critical sense, Professor, and this idea that agrarian transitions in from agriculture into non-agricultural futures is the turning point, you called it. And although you were critical, and I concur with what you said, I do not think that they construe a desirable future or a possible future, because that's almost like a historical impossibility. What it does is to create what you call, Chairperson, the floating population of wage hunters and gatherers who are either underemployed or kicked out of agriculture sector, as Professor Ghuman was saying in the end, and with no secure futures in terms of labor absorption in what's called the non-agricultural sector. I mean, whether services, whether in manufacturing, and those we know aren't really creating employment. I think that's been discussed here. So I think the critical pathway is, how do you change that mindset of following what northern countries did by the way of agrarian transitions, in terms of shifting peoples out in their own countries from agriculture into urban or non-agriculture future. And that they did in a particular historical moment, as we all know, which was when colonialism was there, so that accumulated money was used to create, the industrial manufacturing, intensive industrialization and urban futures, or even exporting their populations. The UK, for instance, exported populations all over the world into settler colonies. I don't think that's the path available for the Indias and Chinas. And therefore, this whole issue that Professor you spoke to of supporting the agricultural sector, subsidizing the agricultural sector, becomes and investing in the agricultural sector. When I say agricultural sector, completely concur with what Professor Ghuman said in the end. That doesn't only mean agriculture, even non-farm within the rural, within the countryside, that becomes very, very crucial. And that's where the question, I mean, it obviously cannot be answered in an interim budget. But since we are talking of a larger point here, and that therefore links to the question Mr. Jaspal Singh now he was asking, whether FPO has a possibility there. Surely, in this budget, there has been some micro enhancement, if I may call it, with this scheme called the Lakhpati Mahila or Lakhpati Didi program. Let's remember that we have 9 crore women. India is a golden land of self-help groups, and reference was made here. We have about 9 crore women into some 83 or 84 lakh self-help groups. And I think this idea of investing, and it addresses many issues because it almost creates a empowerment, enhancing, livelihood investment as far as women are concerned. But if we invest there in terms of turning those SHGs into collectives, cooperatives, farmer producer organizations at a much larger scale, it addresses some of the issues that we are talking to here of empowering agriculture, empowering rural, the countryside, empowering women within the countryside. And that's what we have seen on the ground. To turn the SHGs with mentorship support, with credit support, with subsidies of various kinds, market linkages of various kinds, into what is called enterprises of whether it's cooperative formation, whether it's collective formation, or whether it's what's called these days the farmer producer organizations, but not just linked to only farms, in other value added sort of rural industrialization as well. I think that is the future. One marginal investment has been made in this budget in this regard, and that is to increase the number of such sort of inputs to 3 crore women, to the Lakhpati Mahila Didi program, as it is called, from 2 crores to 3 crores. But I think much more is needed. And I think that's one way to look at how we can address some of the issues that we have been talking to here. As far as countryside or rural in India or farm India or agricultural India, and also addressing the agrarian distress that there is. So that's how I would like to approach this. And thank you for this opportunity. Sorry, Professor Swarna, you wanted to speak.
No, I fully well agree with you, except one point, that is, I'm not talking about North and, decades ago and during the colonial period. But then you look at East Asia, which started shifting their population somewhere in the 80s, has done wonderfully well. We are talking, and then particularly it is known that it is not the type of shift which happened, naturally in the European countries, but it has been completely managed by the governments. That is the point which is more important there. It is the policy initiatives that have been taken by those countries that in fact has systematically shifted people. And if it has been possible there, it is definitely possible in India. Only thing is, we have to look at a very innovative ways of doing it. For example, you look at natural farming. I don't want to take too much of time. The natural farming is highly labor intensive. Where is the labor? Like somebody has already been mentioning that we have shortage of labor, particularly in the peak season. Even for love of money, you find it very difficult to get labor. At the same time, in the non-peak season, you have a huge amount of unemployment. The word coined is labor rationing. I'm not coined any words. All of them, like turning point, labor rationing, all of them are already the literature. There's nothing that I'm inventing here for any reason. So what I'm saying is, it is possible, but then you have to be much more innovative. And then where the money comes from, so all the programs that are being taken up by the government and everything, all the steps are taken in the positive direction. I don't have any doubt about that. But then it doesn't seem to be enough. That is the and the rate of progress is something which makes a difference to the country. That's the only point which I want to make. And there are many programs, but then, for example, look at national farming. It's highly labor intensive. You have so many self-employed people, I mean, who don't have much to do, but why don't you commercialize those natural farming inputs and then convert the, I mean, entire agricultural transformation to occur? In the sense, you're shifting people from non-agriculture, the input manufacturing for natural farming, which is highly labor intensive. So there are opportunities, not that there are no opportunities. And then we have to be more innovative to look at those and implement them to shift even people from agriculture to non-farm agriculture, but based on agriculture. So all the rural non-farm, in fact, is based on agriculture. In fact, we discount agriculture in India, but actually it drives, almost the entire economy, to tell the truth. So even in the urban areas, if you look at non-crop sector, the entire non-crop sector in the semi-urban areas, I mean, all that is in fact is a part of agriculture. So there's a lot of scope. I'm not being pessimistic. I'm definitely optimistic because I didn't have enough time to, talk more about it. I stopped there. But then there are many more innovative ways in which we can really go forward and shift the population and achieve it in our own way, not necessarily the way, the Europe has done it, nor even the export-led growth, like, the East Asia has done it. Maybe it's not possible for us, but there are other possibilities for us for the simple reason that we are a big population, and it is the people who make finally make or break a country, and not necessarily anything else.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those valuable comments. It's the people who make the break on any country. That's a very, almost like a conclusive remark. Anyone else? Vast infrastructure, greenfield development, rural and semi-urban transformation is taking away agricultural land. Will that create jobs or take away the livelihood? That's the next question that Mr. Jaspal has put. Would anybody like to take this up?
Thank you. May I?
Yeah, sure.
In fact, if you are to develop industrially, you need land, of course, certainly. No, so certainly, what type of industrialization we go in for, that is important. Whether we go in for capital-intensive industrialization or labor-intensive industrialization or somewhere mixed in between, that will determine whether it will generate jobs, the number we required or not. Secondly, still, will it empower the rural population, rural workforce to be employable in those days, in those newly coming enterprises and all that? That is another issue. So it is very, very difficult whether this infrastructure, how this will generate jobs, what type of jobs it will generate, for whom it will generate a job. I think there is not much data or information available, at least in my knowledge, in India. So it's very difficult. But one thing is there, that with land would have to be acquired to industrialize the country or to develop the non-farm sector. But how to have balance between the employment generation and land acquisition. And one more, Mr. Chachra, I really appreciate your intervention that, of course, the kind of historical opportunity which the industrial revolution had to transform, to transit workforce from agriculture to non-agriculture sector is not available at the moment to India. And India must have its own customized model. If we cannot push all the 45% workforce, means very big number. We cannot push them out from agriculture to non-agriculture sector at the moment, and we are not ripe yet to create employment for them. Thank you.
Yeah, so Professor Sandhya Iyer, you have a point to make, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you may give me the liberty, I have 3 quick points to make. One is when I was talking about the Vishwakarma scheme, and I think that was very correctly stated that yes, there are allocations, but let me remind ourselves that it is from a fund which was already allocated for 5 years. So the allocation which is coming is only towards the committed grants. But if you look at the performance per se, we do not, and it comes even from the same document which I mentioned from the Economic Affairs Ministry. It does not really say how much it has spread and what is the extent to which it is really getting implemented. So though the idea is excellent to bring back artisan classes and provide end-to-end, we really do not know much about it. With regards to, of course, I'm just moving away for a second on the infrastructure development effects. In the last 3 years, I have been involved in a series of impact assessment studies, both in the New Delhi-Mumbai corridor belt, be it in the larger infrastructure, solar power plants in Madhya Pradesh, etc., etc. Now, let's understand the role of what infrastructure can really do and what it cannot do. We are assuming too many things that it will radically bring around. One, yes, it will bring in improved connectivity. It is going to do a radical change in the ways in which transport and communication may start delivering. Okay. And we also did this evaluation for the Mumbai-Nagpur expressway evaluation and the impact assessment, both social impact, environment impact, and the larger economic impact analysis. So in terms of economic impact, yes, we do find that transportation may improve radically. People are going to be able to access locations faster. Social impact, what it does is, unless and until it is not interconnected with village infrastructure, district infrastructure, and block infrastructure, the local communities are not really going to get any benefit from the large-scale infrastructure processes that have come up. So whether the economic activities of those blocks through which these highways are going have been equally connected and equally well developed, you are not going to see a so-called multiplier change of this large-scale infrastructure. In terms of environment infrastructure, we did find that there was a sharp reduction in the quality of the ecological conditions because we are actually taking away land and not really bringing back ecological balance or environmental balance alongside these structures. So let me put a very humble submission over here for the question raised, whether it will create jobs. Yes, it creates short-term jobs for the infrastructure enterprises, but to bring about a change to the village economy, we need to bring the village in the center of our planning model. And I think that is something which is radically missing in our current understanding of budgets. Now, in the very beginning of my statement, which in the point I said, India wants to replace China. Now, in 1970s, when China became the manufacturing hub, it was already a large-scale enterprising communist economy, had these huge factories, which was creating the capability to become the manufacturing motherland for the world. And it did do for the next 25, 30 years, alongside the East Asian miracle which occurred. So we know that it had a coexistent ecosystem for itself. Talking about a broken global value chain, we are talking about coexistence of economic, geopolitical crisis, and the fact that we ourselves are embedded in a heavy, small and medium scale enterprise situation which are not heavily labor intensive in nature. So for us to do anything from here on, it would either mean we have to bend that much more backwards to connect ourselves internally, or we need to be part of the global value chain. Now, at this juncture, I don't see that. At least data systems are not telling to me that we are connected equally well to the value chain, both internally and externally. Now, if that is the situation, I think the elementary point which I would expect from a budget is being very, very honest, that it cannot be seen as an interim for the sake of it, but throw a responsible statement alongside. If going back to the Vikasit Bharat argument, if India needs to be Vikasit by in the next 25 years, our education system had to get a continued commitment. And if I see the UGC itself, you see a reduction of 4,000 crores of UGC's budget. IITs and IIMs, also there is a 20% reduction in grants, even as the number of IIMs and IITs have gone up, which essentially means students out of the pocket expenditures to education and higher schooling is going to go up, which also means many more children are going to go abroad for higher education and not going to be over here anymore. So the interim means an academic year where a large chunk of youth are not going to be giving access to quality education, though there is private education going on. Schooling education budgets have also increased only by 10 to 15%, even as many more have come in. The third point is, in a post-pandemic, we would have expected health sector also to get a lot of resources with regard to enhancement. We see it completely down. Now, why am I talking about social sectors and employment parallelly, ma'am? It is essentially because budgets talk about what are we going to do in the medium term and what are we going to prepare ourselves in the long term. The very fact that our budget allocations have been reduced for the social sectors means for the next 5 years, children are not going to have access to education. So it does not matter to me whether I read an ASAR report seriously or any other report which my own institution is doing, because we are not investing in quality education domestically. So, and interestingly, even when I look at this national skill mission, the incremental changes that are visible is only to the extent of 5 to 10%. Budget estimates to budget estimates, not even a revised estimates to budget estimate allocation, which means what I have spent last year, I have not even tried to maintain that in the current budget allocation. So making the larger point over here is that for a Vikasit Bharat to take place, if I really am keen to bring my manufacturing sector back on track, I need to talk about the rewiring of India Inc. with the MSME segment, which is, there's no roadmap to it. We are seeing everything as individual segments. There are certain sectors where there is some value chain connection taking place, but not otherwise. The economic census has brought out, as Professor Swarna was talking about, 70% are in single-owned enterprises. We have a startup ecosystem which has only 1 or 2 workers, which do not go through any kind of regulatory mechanisms, which are dying their own natural death due to valuation. I think Baiju's story and others are very well in front of our eyes. Every startup need not be an innovator of a certain kind to bring about that radical change. We need to understand that our youth know what they want to do, but we are not giving them the space to even think sustainably what they can do for themselves. So I think that's my closing remark. Vikasit Bharat means talk about how sustainably we are going to provide budgets to people. Whether our budgets are sustainable or not is a big question. I think that's where I would like to close, ma'am. Thank you.
That's a very strong comment, Professor Sandhya, and a very passionately done statement based on your own work on, reports on infrastructure development that is happening, maybe Mumbai, Delhi, or Mumbai, Nagpur corridors. And it's very interesting what you said, that unless and until we build those networks deep into the rural areas, not much is going to happen. You also touched upon the education and the quality of education. And many in this discussion have spoken about multiplier. Even I spoke about it. Okay, at the typical Keynesian multiplier where you first invest and then it is carried forward through consumption expenditure. I think Professor Ghuman also mentioned this, that unless it gets carried forward through an increase in consumption, which means there is a need to increase employment. So the connect between investment and increase in consumption is through the jobs. So if the jobs don't get created, then the effect of a rise in investment gets clogged. So we can probably only announce an increase in investment, but it will not actually roll out on an increase in income and increase in unless and until there is an increase in employment. So even once again, going back to my reference to the interview that I saw of Mr. Mahendra, who said that he visualizes a dip of 5% in the tractor sales in the next quarter of this year, which means that, consumption is not supporting the demand of either the industrial products or even the farm products. And if our children are going to look at foreign education and going abroad, then it also means, in terms of multiplier, it also means that our multiplier might get exported and we may not have enough to do in our own soil. So Yeah, so we need jobs, and at the same time, we had Professor Rathore who uh, brought out very optimistic arrays, multiple arrays of where the jobs might come from. We can hope that hope is always a good thing to rely on. And anyone else wants to make a final statement, Mr. Chachra, or otherwise, we can probably wish our economy the very best and keep doing good work that we are doing.
Uh,
Yeah, go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir. Please unmute yourself, sir.
Not a final statement, but just one information I want to share from Punjab. 14,000 crore advances have been taken by Punjabi students to go abroad during the last 5 years. 14,000 crore in a small state. This is just education loan from the institutional education loan.
Exactly.
And then you can talk about the selling of assets, particularly land and others. You can well imagine, and I spoke to Mahindra's speech, that certainly the multiplier effect is going out. Not only this, after a decade or so, or maybe more, the physical assets will be transported to the foreign countries. This multiplier will certainly miss here, and our governments are not serious about those. In Punjab, some political parties are saying, we will give this much loan to sport to go out, or we will promote IELTS centers in the public sector and whatnot. So if you don't keep your physical capital, that is a human capital, if you don't empower your human capital, Viksit Bharat is not an easy. And I would like to remind about the Raghuram Rajan's statement a few days back, that even if India's population remains at the same level, growth rate remains 6%, we will not be a Viksit economy, rich economy by 2047. What we, at the most, we will be again a low middle economy. At the moment, we are also low middle economy. So if we compare the per capita income, as Professor Suchita in the beginning very told, the gap, 1,006% gap. If we compare our per capita income with those countries who are rich countries, America's per capita income is 30 times more than our per capita income, and China 6-7%. So we should talk something which we can achieve, and we should sell the dreams to our people, which we can somewhere near reality, not simply the dreams. Thank you.
Thank you once again. So it's good to dream. It's good to dream, but it's important to make sure that we have enough fodder to and enough energy to realize those dreams, and so that we avoid frustration. I hope all the efforts that are being put in infrastructure, and hopefully there will be better attention to education, health in times to come, so that we can realize the aspirations that have been whipped up in the recent past. With that, thank you once again to IMPRI and to Professor Arjun Kumar and his efficient team, and all the veterans whom I have had the good fortune to discuss this important condition at the point of transition that Indian economy is right now. Thank you very much for this opportunity that I have got to learn. Thank you very much.
So as we have come to the end of today's discussion, I, Fiza Mahajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose a formal vote of thanks. On behalf of IMPRI, Center for Work and Welfare, I would like to thank all of you for attending today's deliberation. A panel discussion on employment, livelihoods and interim union budget 2024-25. We are grateful to our chair for the session, Professor Suchita Krishnaprasad, our esteemed panelists, Dr. Sandhya Sayyaji, Mr. Sandeep Chachra ji, Professor R S Ghuman ji, Professor Randhir Singh Rathore ji, and Professor Swarna Sadasivam Vepa ji for taking part in this discussion and enlightening us. We thank all our participants who have raised questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. We are grateful if you are watching us later on YouTube channel or listening to us on various podcasts or reading our publications. You may also find more thematic events and book discussions under IMPRI Web Policy Talk series. We hope you continue to join in the future to our IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. I wish you all a very good day. Thank you.